Hello, class. We've come to our last meeting of the course. It's been intense, but I hope you've gotten something out of it. I hope this is not your last class on Polish culture, but that it has sparked something in you to want to continue with studying Polish culture and society, literature, whatever. So today we are ending with Polish American culture, Polish American literature in particular. Um, so when I talk about this unit, I like to go back in time a little bit. Um, to the roots of Polish American history, Polish American culture. And Polish American history actually begins before the creation of the United States. Um, Now, you may remember from your fifth grade history classes talking about Jamestown. So, Jamestown is the first English colony in the United States. It is not the first European colony, and obviously, it's not the first, human settlement in America. But is the first English colony. Um, well over 100 years before the creation of the United States itself. And of course, learning about this in your fifth grade English class, you learn about, a couple names and you learn about the English coming to settle and staying permanently. But what you're probably not told about is the fact that not only were there English there, but there were Poles as well, and not just Poles, other individuals from Central and Eastern Europe. And the reason they were there is so the English, when they got the contract or whatever to go and settle that place, they didn't really have artisans. They didn't really have people who would make the pottery and who would the smith didn't come along. There were no blacksmiths in the group, right? They were people looking to make their fortunes, not work, right? And so they needed people to do the work, and they got a lot of people from Central and Eastern Europe, and there were a number of Poles among the group. Now, with the beginning of this history, you also get the first labor strike in America. And when I say America, I mean the Americas, right? And it was led by Poles. So this is a great story. So the Poles and some Germans and some other people from Central and Eastern Europe were brought over with the English to do the labor. And when they were making up the, not really constitution, but kind of like colonial contract, right? The English weren't going to give the workers voting rights. The voting rights were only going to be given to the English. And the artisans, the people who were doing the labor, didn't like that. And so, led by Poles, they went on strike. They refused to do any work. And so the beginning of American labor history is actually before the beginning of the United States, and it's a Polish invention, which I think is amazing. So the story goes that they negotiated. The leader of the colony had to sail to England to talk to the actual people who owned the contract of the colony, negotiate with them, and then come back. I think he had to make 2 trips actually, but finally negotiations were settled, and the artisans, the people who were brought over to do the labor, they were given voting rights as well. So isn't that amazing? I think that's an incredible piece of history. I'm also going to give you 2. Oh, shoot. Okay, I gotta do this over again. I hit the wrong button. Ignore that code there. So 2 important names in Polish American history are one is Kosciuszko, and I'll just give you his first name, Tadeusz Kosciuszko. So Tadeusz Kosciuszko was a military commander in Poland. He was important in the during the uprisings. I need to pause for a second. So Tadeusz Kościuszko. Um, sorry, one second. My computer is having a heart attack here. Tadeusz Kościuszko, born 1746 and died 1817. So he was born when Poland was still a free nation. That was a not loaded term for the time, but he was around when Poland still had independence, and so he witnessed the three partitions that ended up making Poland disappear. He actually comes to the United States and helps the colonies at the time in the Revolutionary War. He's one of the leaders of the Revolutionary War, which you don't hear about. You don't hear about Kosciuszko in history classes. You hear about Lafayette, but you know the French guy, but you don't hear about Kosciuszko, probably because his name is too difficult to pronounce. But he becomes a really good close friend of Jefferson, actually. And there are you can find a series of letters between the two translated into English. They spoke French together because obviously Jefferson didn't speak any Polish, and Kosciuszko, his English was not great, but his French was perfect. Most Polish nobility at the time spoke French fluently. That's what they would speak with each other. And so they become close. The letters you can find translated in English. They're actually kind of sad because it's a lot of it is Kosciuszko asking for more money from Jefferson after he leaves the United States to go back to Poland and fight for Polish independence. But you can actually find here. I'll actually find it for you real quick. I'll put it up here. Oh, there are, well, you can find it on your own. There are a number of statues to him, and one of the important statues to him is actually in West Point. He is the founder of West Point. So West Point is the military academy, and he was the founder of it. So the most important military academy in the United States was actually started by a Pole. He planned it and started building it. So after he helps in the American Revolution, he goes back to Poland to try to help Poland regain independence. He becomes a hero in Poland. He wins a battle or two. A couple important battles. He ends up becoming known as the Peasant Prince. He is a nobleman born of nobility, but he's able to convince the peasantry, who before then didn't really care one way or another who owned the country. Being a peasant under Poland was the same as being a peasant under Russia, but he instills in a large group of peasants as a sense of Polishness and patriotism, and he convinces a lot of them to fight. And there's these stories of the peasants taking their scythes, turning them upright to become pikes, and they're he using almost nothing but peasant soldiers. He claims a couple important victories against Russia, but in the end, they end up losing. So this is the tragedy of his life. So he's important to Polish American history. And then we have Kazimierz Waski. Now, if you're a Chicagoan, this may seem familiar to you. He's often called Kazimierz Pulaski, right? Especially in Chicago, Pulaski, right? So until recently, I'm not sure when this stopped, but you may remember having Pulaski Day off from school. It was a holiday that was recognized in Illinois, especially in the Chicago area. And actually, I work also part time for a community college out in Decatur, and I worked at a high school teaching composition out there, in a place called Mount Zion, and they actually still have Pulaski Day off, which is weird because it's so far from Chicago. But I don't think Pulaski Day is taken off by CPS anymore. But anyway, so he is known as the father of the American cavalry. He also fought for the colonies in the Revolution. He was a cavalry officer in Poland during the uprisings, and when he came to America, he taught uh, uh, America how to have a cavalry, and so he is known as the father of the American cavalry even today. He becomes a hero as well. When was he? Let's see, his 1745 to 1779. Um, so he is very young when he dies. I believe he dies helping Napoleon. Um, oh yes, so yeah, he was involved in Napoleon's march against Russia, and on Napoleon's retreat, okay, yeah, he was trying to rally retreating French forces during a cavalry charge, and ended up getting shot and killed. There's actually a statue to him in Savannah, Georgia. Um, so that's there's the Kashmir Pulaski Monument in Savannah, Georgia. So yeah, that is a place to go to. So important thing also before that I forgot to mention about Kosciuszko, he believed in radical liberal independence. He was a liberationist, and he actually held American values more strongly than Americans at the time. When at the end of the Revolutionary War, he was given a plantation and slaves, and he refused both. He freed the slaves and sold off the property to give to the former slaves. He refused to have anything to do with slavery. Whereas Thomas Jefferson made full use of slaves. So who's the real American hero? So there is a lot more to Polish American history than just these few points, but these are kind of the highlights. One of the low points is William McKinley, I think it was McKinley, was assassinated, and he was actually assassinated by a Polish anarchist. But that's a low point in Polish American history. So let's get to Stuart. I always pronounce it Dybek, but I guess he pronounces his name Dybek, but really Polish would be Dybek. He was born 1942, and he actually has an MA from Loyola University Chicago. So he is a fellow alum of your alma mater. He's taught in several places. He's taught creative writing. He's written novels. He's written some nonfiction. I guess he's more well known as a poet than as a fiction writer, but you don't make a lot of money at poetry. So some probably I would say the most important themes that pop up in his work. And it goes back to the idea that I expressed at the beginning of class, the idea of exile versus home. So the immigrant story is a life of feeling a no placeness. The immigrant or the exiles story, I guess I should say. There are a couple. Those are two different ideas, but basically, you are part of an important word here is diaspora. So diaspora means a member of a group who is not in their native land, right? So you often hear about the Jewish diaspora, the African diaspora, and there is a Polish diaspora. There are Poles all over the world, some voluntarily, some not. As far as like history goes. Nowadays, of course, they can leave and come whenever they want, but there was a long time where Poles had to leave Poland for various reasons, either because of occupying powers, which happened repeatedly throughout its history, or because of economic issues. And for example, we see in one of the stories we read early in the semester, a Polish scene, right? The story is all about people trying to escape the dire economic situation of Poland at the time, right? Also, what we find in Dybek's stories is a tension between generations. The in between, and the new generation. So, for example, you get Jaja, right? And Jaja is short for Dybek. This here, which means grandfather in Polish. So Jaja, right? The character Jaja, he is part of this old generation. He's one of the first to leave Poland to come to the United States. The character's mother is this in-between generation, right? She's the first. First generation is what they're often called, right? Born where the parents still remember Poland, still live Polishly, but you're expected to be both Polish and American. What kind of existence does that make? What kind of things are you forced to be, and what kind of expectations are placed on you as part of this in between? And then you have the new generation or generations, right, who were born after that. So people with no memory of the homeland, of the old world. They see the grandparents, they hear the odd Polish word. Their grandparents have accents, but they themselves, the in-between generation, it's almost like they have implanted memories of the old world, right? Being the children of immigrants. And so there's a real struggle in their identities, right? Having to live up to those expectations of being, maintaining Polishness or, any nationality, while at the same time becoming part of this new place. The new generation, the expectations are different. Often the expectations are to completely forget the homeland or the old world, whatever you want to call it, and to just accept the new world, right? But often these new generations want to hold on to something from the old world, despite the pressures on them to forget these things, or not to forget, but to privilege the new place over the old, right? So there are all these tensions going on in this this kind of generational, I don't want to say struggle, but dynamic, I guess, right? So a question is, where does the old world stop, and where does the new begin, right? So that's a question that, it's not a question that isn't really asked, but it's the question that kind of haunts the pages as you're reading these stories. And does the old world ever stop, right? Is there ever an end to this identity? So I just have a few things to point to in the book. This is actually the physical book, if you didn't get it. I'm not gonna. There's, I think you can easily get a lot out of this just on your own reading, and then the discussion the discussion forum, I think, will lead you on to more deeper understanding of it. So I'm just going to point to a few specific spots. Um, um, so let's go to page 6. This is the very end of the story, Farwell. So Farwell is as a title is a neat title because he says it sounds like farewell, right? So living on Farwell means saying goodbye all the time, right? It's this really cool uh, trope he creates, right? But a really amazing line, I think, from the story when he's talking about his friend that he's visiting. Where he belonged no longer existed. So that is an amazing line, and it really gets to the heart of the idea of what it means to be a member of a group, but no longer within that group, right? Right. What does it mean to belong, right? Um, belonging to a place, right? That's an important part of human identity. Sometimes, often, it's all socially created, the idea that you have to belong somewhere, but that is in our culture, belonging has become very important. It's a very important part of identity creation. um, and so it sets up a number of binaries, right? It sets up in versus out, us versus them, right? So in these binaries, the left-hand side of that equation is privileged over the right-hand side, right? So in is better than being out. Being part of us is better than being part of them, right? If you don't belong, you are almost nobody, right? Belonging versus non-belonging. It's very hard to be someone who doesn't belong, right? Um, in our culture, in a lot of cultures, really. Um, so that I think is a really great um, um, line that really gets to the heart. It's really kind of almost the thesis of the entire collection, right? Belonging and not belonging. In Chopin in Winter. So I hope you've heard of Chopin. Chopin is one of the most important musicians and cultural icons in history, and he was Polish. If you had heard of Chopin, you probably thought he was French, which is only half true. He was Polish and French. His mother was Polish. He was actually born in Poland and then moved in later and lived the rest of his life in France. Actually, let me show you this picture real quick. I think this is amazing. Um, there is so in Paris, there's this famous cemetery um, where important personages are buried. Right? It's a beautiful place, um, and there are it's like where the most important people of French society are buried. What's funny though is you'll be going through, and a lot of the headstones, well, like you can see kind of here, a lot of the headstones, yeah, here you go. Like, look at there's this long text, say like, I was, Albert Pernod or something, right? And I was the mayor, Lord Mayor of Paris from this date to this date, and I wrote these books, and I did this, and I did this, and I did this, right? And then you come across this monument, and all it says is Chopin, right? Frederick Chopin, and that's it. Because if you're Chopin, you don't need to list your accolades, right? They're there. Um, and you'll notice there is a Polish flag on his gravesite. Um, Jim Morrison is actually buried there. I don't know if you know Jim Morrison. He had a kind of renaissance in the '90s, but he was Um, the lead singer of the Doors. I don't know if you are into the Doors at all, but what is a more important place to polls probably would be this spot. So um, this is in a church in Warsaw. I think it's the Church of the Cross or something like that. I can't remember now. And if you go in this church, and like everywhere along the walls, on these pillars, you see this kind of thing with different names. And so this was a very common tradition. I don't know if it was particular to Poland. It was probably kind of a pan-Slavic thing. It could have been in other traditions as well. But especially at a time where you couldn't transport bodies back home, when there was no such thing as refrigeration, where you died, that's where you were buried. So if you were anybody like a Frenchman, an Englishman, or a German, or whatever, and you died in a foreign land very far away from your country, that's where you were buried. There was just no way around it. Later on, often important people were exhumed and transported back to their home country, but that was kind of rare unless you were like an important personage. So what would often happen in the Polish tradition is a person's heart would be taken out, and that would be sent back to Poland. And that was the case of Frederick Chopin. So Chopin is buried in Paris, France, but his heart is buried in Poland. And it's buried in this wall here. Tu spoczywa serce Fryderyka Chopina. So here lies the heart of Frederick Chopin. And this also happened with Adam Mickiewicz. He died in Turkey. His heart was sent to Poland. Later, they moved his body back to Poland. Actually, he's now buried in Krakow, where he never even visited Krakow. But he's this really important figure in Krakow today. There's a statue, very famous statue to him in Krakow, even though he never stepped foot there. So anyway, so that's a little bit about Chopin. Look up his music; it's beautiful. You should definitely listen to it. Da, 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 so, an important, I think, passage in Chopin in Winter is on page 15. And I'm not sure if you have an electronic copy, if the pagination is the same. So this is talking about how his mother is very insistent on a certain kind of language, right? She's very insistent on proper language. Um, um, so on 15, right? She says the word is yes, not yeah. She would correct. Or if you want hay, go to a stable. She considered ain't a form of laziness. And then a little bit further down, as far as mom was concerned, all the misuses of language, racial slurs were the most ignorant and so the most foul. So you get this idea that his mother is um, um, very she's very anti racist, anti prejudice. But then so she has this bad reaction to the N word, right, on page 17. And again, this is, this kind of paints her as being this enlightened, progressive person. And then she says, those aren't the kind of famous last words we're going to hear in this family, if I can help it, she promised more than once, as if it were a real possibility. Of course, she'd sometimes add, Shirley has always let Rudy get away with too much. I don't see anything cute about a boy going to visit his grandmother at the hospital dressed like a hood. So hood. So what does hood actually stand in for here? It's just a more polite way of saying the N word, really. So it's this moment that uh, it's difficult to understand that our parents aren't the perfect people we want them to be, and so that is, I think that's kind of the comment he's saying here, right? He has this perfect picture of his mother, but he shows us that he understands that she's not perfect, right? When she says hood, really what she's thinking is the N word, and so that is difficult for him to to deal with. Um, that's something that children have to deal with their parents quite often, or grandparents, right? So it's this kind of kinder, gentler racism, right? Where if you, as long as you say hood, you're a good person. But in your mind, when you say hood, you know what you're thinking. Um, so so page 30. Uh, so page 30. Okay. So yes. All right. That's yeah. So it's the very end of this long paragraph. Um, the paragraph starts, if you want to find it with text search, the room was always cold. Okay, and it's this almost 2 page long paragraph. Um, so near the end of it, everything will be all right, she whispered. Go back to sleep. She sat on my bed toward the foot where she could look out the window, crying softly until her shoulders began to shake. I lay pretending to sleep. She cried like that for nights after my father was killed. It was my mother, not I, whom Marcy had heard. So this takes us back to the very beginning of the story. It's this um, I don't want to say postmodern, but it's something that you don't see in storytelling um, quite often until um, rather recently. Um, Let me just put this in here real quick. Um, we're set up with one expectation, right? So Marty had heard him crying, and that's what is in our, as the reader, we understand Marcy heard him crying, right? And that's in our head for almost the entire story. And then we get to this place where he says, Marcy had actually heard my mother crying. And it's so far removed from the point where, that original uh, piece of information was given. So what that forces us as the reader to do is to go back, right? Now, maybe we don't actually physically turn the pages back to get back to that point, but our mind, our reader's mind goes back to that moment. And so this is a kind of technique where he folds the story on itself, right? He forces in our heads to go back to the beginning, and so um, it's not an extreme case of this. There are some works that where the writer is very does this very uh, technically difficult job of making the story loop back on itself repeatedly, and that is this kind of postmodern move. This is not nearly that kind of extreme example, but it's still this important moment that forces the reader's mind to go back. And so, in a way, the story doesn't end. It loops back on itself, and it keeps coming to this point and looping back on itself again, right? So it becomes a real dividing line in the narrative. Before, it's a more realist um, story, but after that, it becomes a little bit more fantastical, especially with the idea of music being a substance, right? Music as material substance that can linger on in a place. So it's like music becomes this. It's almost like the smell of food. That if a certain kind of food is cooked repeatedly in a space, the food, the smell, because it's actual physical substance, right? The what comes off of food is material. In a literal, very literally, it's material that can actually get stuck in walls. And so you walk into someone's kitchen, and if they, cook a certain way or a certain type of food, that smell will be in the kitchen, right? Even if they haven't cooked there for a long time. And so at this moment of this story, this kind of folding back, this is a marker in the story of the story stopping, kind of not completely stopping realism, but becoming less real, becoming more fantastical moving forward. And the idea of music being a material substance is a marker of that, right? Where the story kind of takes on a less literal sense. And it comes to represent, so this music as material comes to represent memory as a lingering substance, right? The music that hangs in the walls, that become that permeates the walls and stays there. That's how memory works as well, right? Memory also becomes almost this material substance, kind of in a literal way, right? So like material things don't create memory, but they make us remember something, right? So smell is a material thing, and smell is one of the best inciters of memories, right? You'll smell something, and that will take you back 20 years to being in your parents' kitchen, to some memory in there, right? But also physical objects, right? You'll be rooting through your closet, and you come across this random object, and you have memories of something around that object, right? Something that happened where that object played a central role, or maybe even a secondary role, but still it incites a memory, right? And so memory becomes material, like the music in this story. That's all really. That was all I was gonna. There was one thing I wanted to say about the death of the right fielder. Obviously, this is not a literal story. It's more of a metaphor for life itself, right? But so, as a baseball fan, I love this story. So he uses baseball as a way to talk about life, right? Obviously, he wasn't. The guy's not buried in right field. This is not to be taken literally. This is all a metaphorical story. But I love the line in the physical book. It's page 36. Nor could it have been leukemia. He wasn't talented enough an athlete to die of that. Right. So depending on your the talent in your how talented you are in a profession or something, that determines what you're going to die of, right? Which obviously isn't true, and it's not supposed to be taken literally. The whole story is a metaphor, right? I read it as being a kind of way to talk about life itself, the closed circle that is life. Well, not closed, really, not a circle, really. I guess the way we experience life is as a straight line, right? There's a beginning point, there's an end point somewhere. Yeah, closed circle. That's nah. Yeah, I don't think he's going that far. I think it is the straight line, the times arrow kind of idea of life and time, right? We are finite beings. We don't experience life as a circle, right? We experience life as an arrow that has a end date somewhere in the future. Anyway. Okay, so that's all for today. It's been great reading your stuff. I think you guys did